Hey everyone. Awesome. I came on a little early to say hi to everyone and double check that things are working. Mr. Producer's in the other room, double checking too. So I see some of you tuning in. Deborah, Susan, Tracy, Melissa, super. Okay. This little bit before we're at the top of the hour is definitely going to get trimmed away and won't be in the replay. So it's just our opportunity to make sure that the gear is working. It's always a question. I always come with my fingers crossed and my toes crossed to make sure. Everyone can hear okay, just double checking that. Good, more and more people are coming in. That's a good sign. And I'll keep an eye on the time. Good. It is I don't know if you can see it in the picture. You might get glimpses of it as our hour goes on. In the afternoons, my office gets super, super sunny and warm. So I've got actually blinds closed and I'm blocking some of the sun because it's so bright in here. Erin's here. Good. Erin's my right-hand girl and she's here and she can hear well. So that's great. Super. Okay, sound is good. Good, 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 good. All right, like I said, this little bit at the beginning is going to get trimmed off before the replay. Deborah is not hearing. Others are, Deborah. So I'll let Mr. Producer type into the comments. He's listening too, or maybe Erin can give you a hand on that. Sometimes the best way is to exit out and back in, but of course, if you can't hear me, it's hard for you to get that piece of advice. Hi, Faith, Nancy, good. Good, good, good. Okay. We're going to go ahead and gently start. I have just a smidgen of housekeeping before we dive into the workshop. This is kind of a new way for me to be airing a workshop. So bear with us as we try and figure out the details. And even after the fact, if you've got a little bit of feedback about how login worked or finding the lesson and things like that, we're anxious to hear that and try to improve. But as you saw, if you logged in, we arranged it this way so that it's a class on my student platform, Thinkific, and it will always live there, even the replay will. So it gave me an opportunity to give you a little welcome email, to have this live lesson embedded. We're on YouTube at this moment, but you get to it through the workshop course, if you will. And then I can add bits of things that I want to share with you. And in today's case, it's an ebook that I call Tension Headache, anyone? Because we as quilters have all experienced a tension headache. I know we have, or 10 or more. And so, yeah, it's always encouraging to know. And it's the point of that ebook. It's my collection of all the tips and tricks that I've ever learned that apply to getting more beautiful stitches. So that's a real shortcut for you and hopefully a really great reference material as well. Okay, what you guys can't see, you see a nice little clean area on my desk here. The rest of it is covered with my notes and things that I want to show you. And so we're going to alternate between me talking on screen and also I've got some shots of my hands and some tools and some things that I want to show you, bobbin cases and so forth. So we're going to kind of approach it that way. If you would do me a couple of favors. In the comments, I welcome comments in chat to begin with, but if you have specific questions, I'm going to have a Q&A portion at the end. I'm trying to keep my workshop within 60 minutes and I expect that the Q&A will come after that. Totally optional. Just stay for it if you want it. But if you want to throw questions into the chat, would you please type QQ before them so that I can run a search for all the questions at the end and find them all? And that will not be on the replay either because I want to try and keep it to 60 minutes. So stick around if you want to be part of it, not if your questions have been answered. That'll be okay. Today's workshop, let me get my notes handy here. I'm kind of organizing it this way. First off, we're going to talk about the goal, which is obvious, beautiful, well-balanced stitches that are pretty on the top and bottom of our quilts. So the first segment will be a bit about what makes a beautiful stitch. What are some of the factors that affect that? Secondly, we're going to move into ways that you can diagnose or isolate what the specific issue is. And my little ebook that I call Tension Headache Anyone is kind of a pun on the fact that we quilters tend to lump any ugly stitch problem into it's a tension issue, when the truth of the matter is a high percentage of the problems that make ugly stitches are not actually related to the tension dial. So we're going to talk about lots of different things that impact how your stitches form and how you can isolate which one is affecting what you're doing today. Thirdly, we're going to go into some fixes. Again, I've collected as many things as I can think of, as many tips as I've learned over the years, and I'll bring those in then. And then fourthly, we're going to talk just a little, and this may get sprinkled in as we're moving through the workshop, but I want to highlight some ways that you can avoid some of these problems in the first place, because that can be useful, right? All right, number one, what makes gorgeous stitches? How is a stitch in fact formed? What makes it beautiful or not beautiful? Now let me see, you guys, if I can make my pictures show here. Ha, look at that. This is my high-tech drawing of a stitch forming, actually at a sewing machine. And you can see how the green thread is the top thread through the needle. The blue thread is the bobbin thread running along the bottom, however many layers you have. So whether you're sewing a seam on a garment or in fact stitching a quilt, doesn't matter how many layers, the stitches are still formed in the same way. What makes a beautiful stitch is when that twist, you can see the blue and green thread twisting right where the layer of fabrics come together. What makes a beautiful stitch is when they are perfectly balanced. The top thread and the bottom thread meet right in the middle, meet right in the middle, meet right in the middle. And one of the factors that affects that, or one of the things we see first when that's not happening, is that either the top thread, think of it as a green thread, is pulled tight and straight and the bottom thread is looping to meet it, or the reverse. That blue bottom thread is pulling tight and straight and the green thread is looping to meet it. And that looks on our quilting something like this. See how in my loops, this is one of my own quilts, in the circles particularly, also in the wavy line, can you see how this is actually the back of the quilt? The thread is laying on top of the fabric. You're not even seeing hardly the stitches coming through from the other side, or the stitches on this side, I should say, going through to the middle. You're just seeing the thread literally laying on top. That shows that this, the bottom of the quilt, the bottom tension is too tight. Notice though that throughout this picture, that is true to a slightly greater or lesser degree, but that is true throughout the picture. And that's something that I want to talk about a little bit, because sometimes when we see issues that we call tension, right? Tension issues, my tension is off. It will be sporadic. You'll have areas that are pretty stitching and then something will happen. And I'll show you pictures of that in a moment. And that is typically not a tension issue. But in this case, the picture I showed you is in fact where tension has run amok a little bit. My bobbin tension was a bit too tight, causing that bobbin thread to sort of lay flat on my circles, and the top thread was galloping to meet it. That's not great tension. So the truth of the matter is we can categorize all tension issues in kind of 4 buckets. One is, like the picture I showed you, bottom tension too tight. Thread is laying flat on the bottom. The reverse of that would be, it would look almost the same, but from the top side of the quilt. Top tension is too tight. Bottom is galloping to meet it, and therefore you're getting uneven stitches. Third problem, and you might not think of this one as often. Third problem would be when both tensions are too tight. I don't know if you've ever stitched something, I certainly have at my long arm, where often I see it most in a circle as well. And I've stitched around it, and if I run my finger over it, it almost feels like a button. The stitching is pulling that fabric in like a little button. So my stitches may in fact look perfectly balanced, but just be altogether too tight, pulled too tight. And then when they relax, they pull that fabric together. The fourth problem, which we don't see very often, I'll be honest, is when both top and bottom are too loose and they're both sloppy looking on both the top of your quilt and the bottom of your quilt. Don't come across that one very often, but it does exist. Just trying to watch for comments here too. So we've kind of categorized now what our tension issues look like. So now I want to show you a few more pictures of things that are problems, but maybe aren't tension issues. And I welcome you to type into the chat. If you know what these are, let me know if you can diagnose them quickly. Okay. Sorry, this picture isn't super clear. I magnified it so much. We quilters often call these eyelashes. And boy, they're desperate on this quilt, let me tell you. That is not a pretty look. But also, notice that however severe they are around some of the corners and loops, notice that in some areas, the tension actually doesn't look too bad. This is very inconsistent, whatever is happening here. So remember I said earlier, typically when it is in fact a tension issue, you will see it happening all of the time. Sometimes a little bit worse on corners, but all of the time. So do we think this is a tension issue? I suspect it's not. This was someone else's quilting, not my own. But I suspect highly that actually we're looking at the bottom of the quilt in that picture. So I think that the top was not threaded correctly, was possibly not in the tension disc correctly, or perhaps was missing altogether a thread guide and therefore was feeding in irregularly. So that's what caused not just a small difference in the formation of those stitches, but the giant stretched eyelashes, and also what caused the unevenness of it, the sometimes decent and sometimes terrible quality of it, is because the thread is not feeding through smoothly. In some way, it's jerking, and probably that's an effect of not proper threading. Kimberly is asking, am I going too fast? Are you telling me, Kimberly, that I'm going too fast to keep up with? If so, I'll try and slow down my speech a little bit. Okay, I want to show you another picture. Here it comes. Right in the center of this one is the issue. Well, really, there's two issues. One is we do have slightly poor tension because look how this thread is, again, laying on this side of the quilt. This is the underside, laying smoothly, and we're not seeing individual stitches. That's telling us that the thread on this side is too snug. But the other problem we're seeing is this funny little loop, but there's only one. Little loops like this are famous for acting just that way, coming out maybe half a dozen times across a whole quilt. And we quilters, myself included, have really scratched our heads over what in the world is causing that to happen. So I debated over how to organize this today. You know, if I run through all the fixes at once, and I decided I would show you the pictures and kind of talk about some of the causes and fixes as they appear so that you can relate that, and hopefully it's a little more memorable in that way too. So this loop is a personal one to me because I had this happening for a period of time with one of my earlier quilting machines. Every so often, I was getting a little loop, and we're talking small, 1/8 of an inch, but still significant loop. And that to me just spoils the back of a quilt. I was not satisfied with that. Oh, Kimberly is saying the eyelashes are caused from sewing too fast. You might be right, Kimberly. That's going to be one of my suggestions later on. Gotcha. I follow. Okay, back to the loops. In the threading of a long arm machine, not typically on a sewing machine. So we have a couple of dials. One always is the tension discs, right? The discs that come together that our thread goes through, and when your needle is engaged or when your presser foot is down, those discs are holding your thread and it's feeding through smoothly. Every machine that stitches has one of those. But long arms, in addition, a lot of them have something called an intermittent tension disc, and I don't really know what its purpose is other than the thread goes around it a couple of times and feeds on out, and it does not actually hold the thread in a disc. I just think it's intended because there's such a long threading apparatus, it's intended as one more evener, if you will, of how smoothly that thread flows. And around that disc sometimes, and around the tension disc always, there is a little wire that bobs. Now, depending on how much your sewing machine opens up when you're sewing, you can often see this, and at most long arms you can see it. that little wire that the thread flows over literally bobs. So it's a tension spring. And what happens is if that spring is too resistant or not resistant enough, that can affect your thread flow. Now, I'm saying this not to sort of scare you with all the weeds that you can get into with tension issues, but to underline a point that I want to make over and over again today, which is there are a lot of different things that affect how the stitches form. And so when we get to that frustrating moment of trying to figure out what's wrong and why can't I get pretty stitches, it can be frustrating to think, well, there's 101 things to look for, but also it can be comforting to know these are mechanical machines. And if we keep looking at one thing at a time, chances are pretty good we'll happen upon the thing that will fix it. So back to the spring story. I had a service person actually at my house just adjusting kind of the annual cleaning and what have you on that machine. And I asked him about this little loop that I was getting. And he said, oh, you just need to go one more time around that roller before it goes into that tension disc. And did you know, he said, that you can adjust the springiness of that spring. So that's what I did. I just turned that spring the merest little bit tighter and it fixed the loops like magic. So since that time, I've experimented with it a time or two to see if it indeed makes a difference. And it's not always that it needs to be tighter. Sometimes it needs to be a touch looser, but it's something that you can adjust that makes a difference in that stitch formation and is so incredibly helpful. Okay, my husband's sending me notes here. Have viewers click the share link in the top right to watch on YouTube directly, and then they can participate in the chat. Okay, Erin, do you want to just type that right into the chat so that people can follow it and maybe pin it to the top? See if that works. Okay, let me get back to where I was here. We did the tension. Okay, loopy. I have another photo for you. Let me make sure I get the right one. Okay, check out this one. Isn't that some pretty stitching? Also on the back of someone's quilt. You can see the red snappers there. Not surprisingly, I'm pretty sure it will not come as a surprise to any of you. This is not a tension issue. It's a little beyond that, but this is very definitely, because this is the bottom of the quilt, this very definitely says to us, this is a top threading issue. That top thread has no tension on it. It is just wildly flying off the spool and landing absolutely anywhere, causing that enormous issue. That's probably the worst one I've ever seen. But you do occasionally see, you know, little nesties here and there, and that's more common. But it's kind of funny how so often an issue that is the top thread, how smoothly it's feeding, whether there's tension on it, will show up on the bottom, and vice versa. So it's helpful to know that when the back of my quilt is where funny tension stuff is showing up, often the first place you should be looking is actually the top thread. It's not necessarily the bobbin that's giving you trouble. So that can help you too. Okay. Let's talk about first, we're going to talk about some fixes. We're going to talk first about ones that are tension related, and then we'll get to the broader ones that are not tension related. So I mentioned earlier on, but I'll mention it again. I included with this workshop a link to a downloadable and printable little ebook. This is one that I wrote. It's, I don't know, 20 pages or so, kind of large print, of all the tips I've collected that relate to forming beautiful stitches or finding fixes. So the things I'm talking about today, by and large, you can find in there, but I'm trying to do my talking from a little bit different perspective because all of you can go home and read the book. I don't want to just work through it with you today. I want to try and give you some other perspectives too, but there's enough information in there that you can take notes beside it, and maybe that will just trigger some of these thoughts of what I'm talking about today too when you're working at your sewing machine. Okay, some tension fixes. So first off, some of the first pictures I showed, and maybe I should show mine again. Hang on one second here. This was my poor tension one. This is the bottom side of the quilt, right? Showing me that my bobbin thread at a minimum is tighter than my top. That does not necessarily say it's the bobbin that's too tight, right? I still don't know which one is too tight or too loose. I just know the bobbin is looser than the top. Does that make sense? Proportionally. So here's how I look at tension fixes. When I'm working at my long arm, maybe I'll preface it the other way. When I'm working at a domestic sewing machine, like even sewing garments or regular seams, sewing backings together and so forth, typically at a domestic machine, we don't adjust the bobbin tension very often at all. There just seem to be fewer variations at a domestic sewing machine, and what little there are can generally be touched up by just adjusting the dial. But when you're at a long arm, it seems like there are more, maybe because they're more self-help, right? You can sort of get at everything to make adjustments, but it seems like when we change threads or when we change bulkiness of fabric, often we need to make tension adjustments. So that said, here's my rule of thumb at the long arm. I always start with my bobbin as the baseline. So this is how I determine my bobbin I know is looser than my top thread in that example, right? But is the bobbin too loose or is the bobbin right and I need to adjust the top, right? How do I come to that decision? This is how I get there. Bobbin is baseline. I think most long arm brands will recommend a tension of 210 to 220 for your bobbin. Now, what that means is they're millinewtons, I think. And you know what? Of all the things I brought to show you, I didn't bring my TOA gauge. But there is a little gauge called the TOA gauge. You can literally fit your bobbin casing on. Here's my bobbin casing. I can pull out the thread around a little pulley and it'll give me a little dial readout. It's like a weight gauge. It'll give me a little readout. Yep, you're 210 or 205 or 240, whatever the case may be. 210 to 220 is the standard. And so if you measure a bobbin that way, and if it is correct, then you know it's time to be adjusting your top tension. If you measure the bobbin that way and you find, in our example, my bobbin was looser than my top, right? So if I find that my bobbin is reading a little under 200, then I know, aha, the bobbin is the culprit here. Did that all make sense? Someone type in the comments. It can be tricky to explain. A couple more things about measuring that tension in a bobbin. When I set a bobbin on my hand, like so, and I pull on the thread, can you see how my bobbin stands up but doesn't lift off my hand? This has long been called the dangle test. And I'll be honest with you, if you don't have a TOA gauge, they are pretty pricey little pieces of equipment. And this is a perfectly acceptable way of testing a bobbin. I did this for hundreds of quilts, right? And especially if you quilt quite a bit, you will get highly attuned to the feel of that bobbin when it's at the right tension. And that's perfectly fine. I'm not here to tell you you have to go out and get the equipment. However, if it's something you're struggling with, getting good tension, or if you regularly change thread types and you're having to dial this in again, it might be a helpful gauge to have because it gives you that readout. This is how hard the pull is on your thread. Tammy is asking if 210 to 220 is the measurement for all long arms. For all the brands that I know it is, especially the ones that use the M class, the big bobbins, but if in doubt, absolutely check your manual or ask your dealer. But I'm pretty confident that your manual will give you a suggested, at least a range for the tension on that bobbin. And it's just so valuable. But I just want to underline like crazy. The bobbin tension is where I start at my long arm particularly. So if I'm having tension, no matter whether it looks bad top or bottom, I start by saying, is my bobbin correct? Because that tells me where I need to go next. Then, oh look, Mr. Producer brought the gauge. Here it is. Okay, let's try out the handy hand camera, you guys. Hang on a sec here. There we go. Okay, this is how the little gauge works. The bobbin sits in it exactly like it would in a sewing machine. You got to get it in there correctly, and then it snaps into place. And now it's firmly fixed in there. I can't turn it. And important, look at the sun shining on it. There's my sunny afternoon. Important that it's laying fairly flat. I sometimes rest it on the rail of my long arm, but doesn't work as well when you do it upwards like this, right? So important that it's laying flat. And then you simply go around the little pulleys and pull. And here's your readout. And you can see mine is reading a little low. So I would be adjusting that bobbin. And you have access on the side here to the screw, so it's actually quite easy to adjust and then pull it out again. A couple more things I want to say since I have this trusty gauge here. One is you can't get a good reading by just pulling 3 or 4 inches like this. You need to have, I know it wastes a little thread, but you need to have a solid 12-inch pull or more to get a decent reading on that. Do you see that? Because I get differences. Also, if you see the dial jerking like this, that is an indicator of a poorly wound bobbin. It frankly does not happen very often, but I have had it occasionally. And it'll wreck your tension in short order. Having said that, let's look at another picture because it ties in with what we're going to talk about next. Bobbins. Bobbins being the critical underpinning of everything. Even winding your bobbin really matters. So what I've got in the picture here is a freestanding bobbin winder. Now yours may look like this or totally different, but they all work on the same principle. You've got your cone of thread through a holder, through a tension disc, and then winding the bobbin. Now a couple of things come into play here. It needs to be around the tension disc correctly, right? So that it does in fact flow smoothly, just like the tension disc on your sewing machine or long arm works. And secondly, all of these independent winders, even if they're on a long arm machine, they have an automatic release. When they get so full, pop, they stop winding, right? That is super helpful, but that is a thing that you can change on freestanding bobbin winders like this one, or I drive a Bernina machine which has a built-in bobbin winder on the side of it. In both cases though, you can adjust the sensitivity of that release. This matters because if your bobbin is wound super, super, super full, you will run into some issues. I'll just get out my bobbin so you can see it. Let me put it in a place where you can kind of see. This one, of course, does not have very much in it at all. But if you wind a bobbin level full with the edge or a little bulge around it because you want your bobbin to last as long as possible, what will happen when you put it in your bobbin casing is there will be a bit of friction as you're trying to pull out the thread. So that will make your bobbin not so well to begin with. And if you adjust your tension down for that, then as your bobbin lessens, you're going to lose that and it's going to change. And that's going to be a problem. And also, if your bobbin is too full or too tight, you tend more often to run into problems like it jerking in there and getting a wrap around the peg that's in your bobbin winder. So just having a bobbin too full can cause a number of issues. So I recommend, and I have adjusted this setting on my long arm, I recommend having just that little bit of clearance, like less than a 1/16 of an inch from the full height of the bobbin to how full it gets of thread, right? I know it can be so very, very tempting to want to just pack every yard in there that you can, but it does not serve you well, which reminds me of a funny saying my mother used to have. She had a saying for absolutely everything, and she spoke German. So she always said it in German and then it rhymed really cool, but I don't know how to say it in German. But essentially it was about hand stitching. And she would say, long thread, lazy girl, meaning if you cut a ginormous thread and then you're trying to do hand stitching and then it tangles and then it breaks and then, right? It all takes longer and makes more work for you because you're trying to save, right? So it's kind of like that with the bobbin. You will get better results if you don't fill your bobbins chock full to the very top. Okay, let's talk about some more bobbin winding things. We've talked about unevenness of tension there. A few things that have come up for me over the years, not often, but occasionally enough that I'll tell you about them, is, like I mentioned, a bobbin that feeds in spits and spurts and is jerky. In some way, that just means it is not a good wind. It is not smooth. It does not have even tension on it. At one time, I had a machine that had a built-in winder, but it was the same motor as the sewing motor. This was a long arm, right? So whenever I engaged my long arm and was stitching, that bobbin was winding like crazy. And when I would press stop, the bobbin would stop. And then when I would stitch, the bobbin would start. Well, you can imagine what that does to smooth bobbin tension. And so that was the first time I went and invested in a independent freestanding bobbin winder because I could not consistently get bobbins that would sew well. And you might not think of that, but experience has taught me that. So that's something you might think about. If your machine has an onboard winder, does it stop and start with your stitching? That may be a reason why you're getting poorly wound bobbins, which would contribute to poor, thread flow and therefore ugly stitches. I'm trying to watch the comments just in case there are some that we want to include in the discussion. Meg is asking if I can repeat what number on the TOA gauge is too tight or too loose. My machine and most long arms that I know recommend 210 to 220. I do know that at one time I had a long arm that preferred it. My dealer suggested it, and my machine seemed to prefer it way up around 250, but that's the only time I've ever seen that. So, and Karen is saying, my bobbin seems to vary with how full it is. Full can read different from half full and quarter empty. What do I do? I do not have a magic answer for that one, Karen. I sometimes have that problem at my machine too. It is lessened when I don't wind my bobbin so terribly, terribly full, and when I make every effort to get a smoothly wound bobbin. Something else that was suggested to me was when I am winding the bobbin, though on my machine it is on board, but its own motor, I still don't run that motor at 100%. I actually run it at about 65. And I've heard this from a number of other quilters too, that they just get a better quality, less problematic wound bobbin if they wind it a little slower instead of just, pressing the pedal to the metal on that speed control for the bobbin winding. So you might give that a try, Karen, and see if that reduces it. I do still find too that there is a bit of difference when the bobbin is mostly full to when the bobbin is mostly empty, but I've been able to mitigate that enough that I don't have to actually adjust my tension. It's very small. Nobody, most discriminating quilter, would see the difference at the end. Okay, and Sand is saying that her machine recommends 120 to 130, and she posted a link to the TOA on Superior Threads. That is a very low number. That surprises me. But I will say Superior Threads has a fabulous website. If you want information about which thread to use with which needle on which fabrics and which bobbin and top to match together, Superior is like a little college education on thread and needles. So that's a great, great place to learn some information. Okay, Meg's asking me if I use my Bernina to wind bobbins or a freestanding winder. I use my Bernina because it's a separate motor. It's in effect the same as a freestanding one, right? In that it's running entirely independently of my stitching. Okay, let's keep moving. How are we doing for time? Gotta keep an eye on the time here. 4:30, we're halfway. Hope so. All right, so I think I've underlined pretty boldly, pretty strong capital letters that your bobbin is your baseline, particularly at the long arm, that your bobbin is where you start. Make sure that it is well wound, that it is not overfilled, and that you've got it at the correct tension setting before you start messing with the top dial. Then, when you do go to adjust the top, it should only be fine tuning, or which we'll talk about a little bit later if you're using some specialty threads and need to make some specialty sort of adjustments. But typically the top adjustments are very fine and they're just fine tuning. Now, in my experience, top tension can be a little bit of a tricky thing. When I did purchase my Bernina, this was one of the attractive things to me, is that it has a digital tension control. And so its default is 4.0, which I love because I love a baseline, something to come back to. But if your machine has a dial type control, you might need to take different measures. On sewing machines, typically those dials will have a number, so you might want to take note of what your machine number that typically works best for you is. And on some long arms, there is no number at all, so it's just a turning dial. And so if you adjust it for one quilt or one type of thread, you have no way really of getting back to where you were yesterday. One quilter suggested, and I think this is a great idea, that you literally, when you get it dialed in for your most common thread and most common fabric that you love the most, actually use a Sharpie to mark on the dial itself and on the machine itself, so you have something to come back to. And also talking about baseline, if you're having trouble with your tension, maybe even if you're not, if you're a new quilter too, make yourself a baseline of products and tensions that work well. And what I mean by this is, don't be trying out all the things. Don't be trying out a new thread today, a different thread tomorrow, working on digitally printed cotton today and then using a minky backing tomorrow. Take some time to use the most basic things. Cotton fabric on the top, cotton fabric on the bottom, your most common batting in the middle, an all-purpose sort of thread and a medium sort of weight and your most common type of needle, and try to get your pretty stitches dialed in using those basic materials, because that's kind of establishing a baseline too. If nothing else, it's establishing your mental baseline and understanding. And then if you change those factors, kind of do them one at a time so that you can make adjustments as you go. Because you can understand if you use a different fabric, a different thread, and a different type of batting all in the same day, it's going to be very hard to isolate a problem if indeed you're having one. As a long arm quilter for hire, I'm kind of known for picking my favorite thread and sticking with it. My favorite happens to be Isacord 40 weight. That's 100% poly thread. There are other fabulous threads out there. It's not that I think that's the only good thread. It's that when I get really familiar with it and I know that I know what the bobbin setting should be and what the top tension should be, and I know that it works with all these different fabrics, that appeals to me. It's one more factor that does not change very often in my quilting, and therefore it helps me to achieve more often pretty stitches without having to fuss with it. Okay, I see some I see some great ideas coming in here about identifying some ugly stitches. And again, I've talked a lot about isolating the tension, but sometimes it's just finding them and being aware of them that is the first issue. So the one suggestion that was made here, which is a lovely one, is to run your fingernail along the bottom of a line of stitching, like quite firmly. And if your bottom thread is tight or your top thread is loose and the top is forming these galloping stitches, you will hear that. And we call that railroading. It'll be tick, 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 tick as you run your nail along the bottom. That can be a great way of determining what the underside of your quilt is doing without literally crawling under it. Another way is to crawl under it. I've done that many, many a time. I have a flashlight on my smartphone. I bet you do too. Crawl under there and have a look. Another way is to use a handheld mirror. I usually keep one at my long arm, and so it's easy to just walk around to the back of it. I don't have like a built-in under quilt camera. Maybe some of you do, but I've just used a handheld mirror in conjunction with my flashlight to have a look at the stitches on the bottom. I've known quilters to go so far as to put a full-length back of the door type mirror on their table so they can see a lot of those stitches from the bottom. So all of these things can help you find it sooner and avoid some of the frustration that comes when you've done a whole lot of quilting and it's all got to come out. That said, here's one little tip. When you do have poor tension, usually it's the back of the quilt that's laying flat and the top of is bouncing, because if it was the other way around, you would have seen it sooner, right? So typically when you have a whole bunch of it that needs undoing, it's on the bottom that it's pulling tighter. Far, far, far easier to undo that from the wrong side of the quilt. So depending on what your take-up mechanism is, you can often do that on the back of the roller and you can undo great long lengths of it at a time. That's a little side note. Maureen is asking a question which is really useful here. We won't save it till the end. When you're quilting, let me throw it up on the screen. When you're quilting and stitches look great on top of one type of fabric and not on another in the same quilt, what do you do? Maureen, I just try and get my attention adjusted well for the fabric there's the most of. This is a fairly common problem because different fabrics, they affect the stitch formation. They absolutely do. And it happens when you're doing, say, a memory quilt, and it's got some shirts in it and some jeans in it and maybe a bit of t-shirt in it and maybe a bit of cotton and maybe a ripstop nylon, who knows? and those will all respond a little bit differently to the tension. So my answer is just to pick the type of fabric that there's the most of and do the best possible tension on that. I certainly don't think that you can adjust, for little pieces. I hope that helps. Okay. Another tip in finding the baseline, another great tip that I've seen is if you use thread cones, it's to take a Sharpie and make some notes on that. Here was my bobbin adjustment, or maybe here was the type of bobbin thread I used with this one, or the type of needle that I used with it. Notes like that on the bottom of a cone can be helpful if indeed you're changing from time to time. How are we doing for time? 4:38. Okay, we've got to get on to the non-tension fixes. Okay, we've addressed what happens when your top thread and bottom aren't aligning and you need to make small fine-tuning adjustments to get that all smoothed out. But what about all the issues I alluded to earlier that aren't the tension dial? They aren't the screw on the bobbin holder. What are some of those? There are lots, but let's go through them. I'm going to start with one fairly recently, maybe 6 or 8 months ago. I was recording some videos for my, I have a free motion quilting masterclass that's all about quilting, lots and lots of edge-to-edge type designs. And I was re-recording some of those lessons, and I was trying to add to my course each design quilted out at my domestic machine. Now, I've not quilted at a sit-down machine much in the last 10 years because I've had a long arm. Why would I? But I wanted to brush up that skill again. So when I sat down to do that, I found, not surprisingly, that the movements did not come easily. My muscle memory was kind of shot over how to do that. But even as my memory of where to go next for the designs came back, I still struggled with uneven tension at the corners. And I'm just realizing as I'm saying this, I actually had a picture of this to show you, and I didn't get it loaded into my production. I'm so sorry about that. Because what I wanted to point out was, in this example, I'm quilting a little placemat-sized bit with paisleys. And on the front, it looked absolutely beautiful. But when you flipped it over, on a lot of the curves, you saw the bottom thread pulled too tight. On a lot of the points of the paisleys, you saw the top thread looping a little bit. And I looked at that and thought, what in the world is wrong? What do I need to do with the tension, right? Blame it on the tension. But actually, as I quilted a few more pieces, it magically got better. So of course I'm thinking about that, and I'm reading over other people's, Facebook groups and what have you, their experiences. And I realized something that might come as news to you. It kind of did to me. I hadn't really thought of it this way before. But when you're working at a sit-down machine, the smoothness with which you move directly affects the stitch formation. So much so that I actually went and made a little video about that for my students, because I showed them a piece that I was working on when I started this morning and what it looked like on the underside. I quilted for 10 or 15 minutes and how much better it looks on the underside. And I never moved a dial, right? That was 100% due to me getting smoother in my movements. So I realized, and this may help some of you, it's not only the fact that I hadn't been quilting at a sit-down machine much in several years, it's also when I come to my machine in the morning and I'm a little bit stiff and I'm not quite relaxed yet. So before you rush to turn the dials and make adjustments on that, especially if you're new to machine quilting, I wouldn't even worry about the tension for a while, even if the stitches are not looking beautiful top and bottom. More important for you to get that smoothness of movement, because a lot of the tension issues will just disappear when you do that. That is so, so critical. Okay, that's one. Related to that, when you're sewing at a long arm, to some degree, the smoothness of your movements affects. And someone mentioned earlier, the speed of your movement can affect it. Kind of funny story. I've worked a lot of quilt shows for Bernina, so standing in a booth and lots of people come by and try the machine and move on. Another person comes by and tries the machine and moves on. And we used to get what we called the Zoomers, which would be someone who would come in and just vroom that machine as fast as it would go 3 feet across the quilting sandwich. And guess what? The tension was ugly. Surprise. And what we learned, which we kind of knew beforehand, was when you're running it at absolutely top speed like that, it's beyond its outer limits of good stitch formation. So the lesson here is you will get better stitches if you don't run it at the top end of its capability, much like winding the bobbin, right? You do not get perfect results when you run it at 100% of its possible speed. You get better results when it's at 65. Similar principle holds true when you're quilting. When the stitch regulator is turned on and you want perfectly even stitches, you'll get a better result when you stay well within the parameters of the machine's capabilities. A couple of other things that make a huge difference at the long arm in stitch quality. One of them is the height of your fabric against the nose of the machine. Now you can see when you think about a domestic sewing machine, the fabric is resting right on the table and the throat plate, right? And so there's no distance there. But at a long arm, because it's held on rails on both sides, that fabric sometimes is literally lifted above the throat plate and can be bobbing like this when you're stitching. And that will break threads. It will give you skipped stitches. Sometimes it will literally prevent stitches from forming at all. So that can be controlled in a couple of ways, kind of machine specific. So if you're running a gamble, for example, the take-up roller, literally you raise that roller as you get a fatter and fatter quilt sandwich. So the quilter needs to be adjusting that regularly and often throughout a quilt. On my Bernina machine, there's actually a bar that my quilt goes under and then rolls up. So that bar is fixed. It does not change. However, I need to know that it's at the right place when I begin. Also at our Berninas, we have a presser foot more like a sewing machine. So when we're stitching, that foot literally lowers toward the fabric, and we can adjust on some of the feet. We can actually adjust the height of it. Is that all making sense? So I literally can control how close down that foot bobs with every stitch. And if it's too high and it's not even touching the fabric ever, once again, I'm going to get the same problems, the skipped stitches, possibly no stitches actually forming, or shredding and breaking thread. And all of that has to do with the precision with which our thread is meeting in the fabric. And if the fabric is wobbling up and down like this, that precision action is not very precise. And it's a mechanical machine, so that really affects the stitches. Okay, more questions. Let's see. Smooth movements, threading. Another one at the long arm that can really affect your stitches is how tight your quilt is. So it's loaded on rails front and back, right? And we can tighten up those rails. I'm full of stories today. When I bought my first long arm, it was a private purchase from a lady who was a long arm quilter. And so I went to her home and she's showing me some of the early things that she quilted. And she's saying to me, because I'm an utter newbie this particular day, she's saying to me, now don't pull your quilt sandwiches too tight. This is what happens. And she had a quilt hanging on the wall that she had actually torn the fabric, not a seam, but torn the fabric, because she thought the tighter it is, the neater it will be, the better, right? Actually, that's not true. You do not want to be able to bounce a coin off your quilt sandwich. Here's why. Think of that needle going up and down through the fabric, right? However many times a minute. My machine does a max of 2,200 times a minute. That's fast. With every down and then back up while my machine is moving, that needle is flexing with every one. Well, if that fabric is so tight, it's going to affect that flex and the machine's response to it. Again, skipped stitches, broken threads, maybe even broken needles if I'm pushing it that hard against a tight fabric. I do think that there's an extreme to which you can go, which is when your fabric is sagging front to back, or it's so loose from side to side that you're getting wrinkles in the back. That certainly is nobody's goal. However, you only need enough tightness to keep those wrinkles from forming. So when you're tightening your rails, I don't feel like the fabric should actually sag, but it should only be one click further, right? And likewise, your clamps on the side. You do not want them stretched and pulled on your quilt. You just want enough tension to hold it out smooth. That's all you need. That can affect your stitches in a huge, huge way. More even than affecting the tension of the stitches, it will be something that's likely to affect breakage, as I mentioned, or skipped stitches. That can commonly happen. All right, smooth movements, threading. Okay, I have one other one. This one is kind of new to me. I hadn't thought about this until not too long ago, at least in these terms. And that is, we're running, especially at long arms, but even at a lot of our domestic machines, they are high-end machines, they're precision machines, they're often expensive machines, and they're very carefully and very precisely engineered. It behooves us then to use good quality equipment. And this is across the board. This is good quality thread. Because if you have poor thread with short fibers or corners that are cut in the spinning of it, for example, you're just not likely to get beautiful stitches out of that. And you're much more likely to run into problems. Likewise, if you buy knockoff brands of needles, here's a story from my own experience. Once upon a time, I found some M-class bobbins and some, knockoff brand on eBay, I think. And I bought a bucket of 50 M-class bobbins. And when they came, over time, as I started using them, I saw that either they were too loose, they wouldn't even hold on my bobbin winder, or they were too tight. I couldn't even get them into my bobbin casing, showing poor engineering. Anyway, long story short, I threw away 17 of the 50 bobbins. Like, they literally wouldn't work. But then I got thinking, well, what about if some of them were not that extreme, but were still not quite right? They don't spin as freely as they should in the bobbin casing because they're a little bit too tight. So I'm not necessarily one to rush away and buy the most expensive thing out there. However, I do think when we've already invested in our machines and we're asking them to do wonderful, reliable work for us, it is worth giving them great tools to use. Funny story, when I was a kid, we had a couple of family friends. One was named Marie, one was named Joanne, and Joanne made the most marvelous brownies you've ever met. Oh my goodness. And Marie asked her for the recipe, and Joanne, sure, I'll share the recipe with you. Well, Marie was a bit of a health food nut, and so she says to Joanne one day, I wonder what would happen if I replaced the cocoa with carob. And Joanne said, well, I don't know, but you should sure try it, see what happens. And then another day, Marie comes and says, well, I really don't want to eat sugar, so I wonder if I replace the sugar with honey, how that would work. And Joanne kind of said, well, I mean, it is different, but give it a try. And then Marie came to her again and said, I really want to cut back on the oil in the things I'm eating. So what would happen if I replaced the oil with, or the butter probably was in brownies, replace the butter with bananas, mashed bananas? And Joanne kind of threw up her hands at that point and said, you do whatever you want with it, but don't call it my recipe. Which we always thought was a hysterical story. But the moral to this story as it relates to our long arms is when we buy them, or even our sewing machines, we're promised XYZ results. Bernina, for example, it's Swiss engineering, it's high precision, and they claim our machines will sew through practically anything. They will make a beautiful stitch no matter what, etc., etc. But if I give that machine terrible quality thread, knockoff brand bobbins, and needles that are questionable, I cannot expect the same result that they told me I would get. Does that make sense? So I try to balance that with, I do not think you need all the gadgets, all the tools, and the most expensive ones that exist. But I do think that you need to invest in products that equal the value and consistency and engineering of the machine that you're sewing on. That's going to give you the best possible results at your machine. We're at 4:52, and you guys, we may include our Q&A in the replay because I'm pretty much through my notes. I'm just going to cast my eye over it again. Hang on one second. I do want to show you a few more things. I do. I see something that I missed and we want to go over, and it will take us 8 minutes. Okay, we've talked about tension issues specifically and how to fix them. We've talked about non-tension issues and chiefly how to fix them. I want to talk about one more thing that I think is a big contributor to a number of problems that we have at our machines, but particularly to ugly stitches. And the solution to this one is cleaning our machines well and often. And I did bring a few tools to show you things that I clean with. Yeah, I jumped the gun on saying we're done. That was not true. I've thought of a few more things as we're talking already. Okay, let me change my camera here. All right, a few things that I brought. These are some of my favorite cleaning tools. This is the one that came with my machine. It's kind of a stiff, short bristles there, stiff, longer bristles here. I like this one, but I like this one better just because it's so big. And look how scruffy it is. This is what I clean around the bobbin area on my machine. So my long arm opens wide, and so does my sewing machine actually. The case opens in front of the bobbin. And this length of bristle, and the more scruffiness I get, the more it gets in there and pokes out all the linty bits that are held up in the bobbin. So I use this brush a lot to do my cleaning. This one I like too. It's a super soft makeup brush actually. And it tends to, you can see the lint, it tends to grab the linty pieces and pull them out. And also I use this one kind of everywhere else on the machine. So areas that I'm afraid this might scratch if I get too robustly, cleaning, this will be much better. So I use this sort of all over my machine. The thread winders, the bobbin pigtails, all those sorts of things, I use this everywhere. And then lastly, I also use a little mascara wand. Pipe cleaner would work as well. These are very short and you can kind of bend the little brush and get it in where you need to. And I particularly like this around my bobbin casing area, like where it's very close in. And sometimes because I oil there regularly, it gets an oily kind of lint buildup. Well, this is very good for getting in there and just cleaning that off. Really good. This is another fun one. I've got so much stuff here with thread, you guys. It's crazy. This is a bobbin casing. You guys will all recognize that. And this right here is our tension adjustment when we do need to, in fact, adjust the bobbin tension. But how many of you know how to clean this casing? So there's a couple of places. I start by blowing briskly into the top of it. I sometimes take that little spring out and clean around there with my little brush, right? I've got fuzz on it. Jamie Wallen even recommends the tiniest bit of oil on the end of a Q-tip or a cotton swab in that bobbin casing. And this is the one that I love. This spring right here that your screw adjusts, that has tension on it. That's what determines how hard this squeezes your thread when it's coming out. Well, lint is famous for catching under here. So a business card will get right under there and clean it. It is fantastic, and it is unbelievable how a tiny little bit of lint under there will in fact cause a problem in your stitch formation. So cleanliness, as they used to say, is before godliness. Okay, I'm putting myself back on the screen here. Cleaning, I do think is, I kind of treat it as, you probably all know this already, but just in case you don't, I've asked sewing machine and long arm technicians both this question: what's the number one problem you see? And they both have the same answer. It's lint. Always. That is an issue, that lint has gotten into bits and places that it shouldn't in a machine, and it causes issues. So when I do have a tension issue, I kind of run down through this checklist, and you've got an idea in my little tension headaches book. But my mental list is kind of from most common and easiest to, least common and harder to do. And it has to do with things like this, starting by taking the bobbin out, rethreading it, putting it back in, making sure that's all done. Secondly, cleaning out the bobbin area and the bobbin casing and oiling. Thirdly, rethreading the top. Fourthly, if that has not fixed my issue yet, I will often go and literally check and clean and maybe floss my thread through all the places that the thread runs. Sometimes you have those little pigtail holders. It is possible for those to get a worn spot on them, right? So isolating and figuring out if there are any areas, any threading point that is causing a hang up, that is causing you grief with your threading. After that, I start getting into tension adjustments, honestly, after I've done those kind of run-of-the-mill things. And even with the top threading, I don't know if it's certain types of fabric, but I know it has happened to me and it's happened to other quilters too. The odd time your thread, which runs through the tension discs, will somehow get flicked out of there and not have proper tension anymore in the middle of stitching. And all of a sudden you're like, what in the world happened? So just unthreading it and going back and doing it again can sometimes highlight that issue. I see in Facebook groups all the time, people are there. I'm sure you see this too. People are there saying, this is happening to me. This is frustrating, that. And often the answer from more experienced quilters will be, are you sure it's threaded correctly? Because it's all too easy to just whack that out and say, yep, got it. But what if you're missing a little something? What if there's a little guide that you've forgotten, or you don't sew frequently and maybe just since last month you've forgotten that it's there? What if? So that's worth going back to your manual even and just double checking, have I passed it through every point that I should? And sometimes that will isolate an issue too. A few of these questions we're going to save. I do see them coming in. Oh, we are at 4:59. Okay. How are we doing? Have I been too rambling? Have I kind of covered this well for you? Truly, I do welcome your feedback, even if you want to send an email after this is over. I expect I'll do this workshop again, and so it just helps me to get a little better each time. I think at that point we'll end it for the replay, and I'll spend a little time now answering some questions. Okay, let me just run a quick search here for the cues. Jennifer is asking, is there a way to see your tension discs on a domestic machine? It depends a little bit on the machine. I have an older Singer 301, for example, that the tension dial is on the front, and I can see the tension discs in that one. I do know with more and more contemporary machines that are more computerized, it's not as easy to see. You usually can open the end of the machine and see that intermittent tension spring that I spoke of, and you can kind of tug on your needle thread and you can see that bobbing and see a little bit what's happening there. I don't know that I would make an adjustment to that spring on a domestic sewing machine, but I do know it can be done on a long arm. Okay, Jeanette is asking, is that number, and referring to the 210 to 220 for the TOA gauge for the bobbins, is it consistent for all thread sizes? This is a super question, Jeanette, and one that I should have addressed as I was talking, but I'll get it now. That number is consistent, but think about the threads. If you put a 40 weight thread in the bobbin, 40 weight is thicker than, say, 80. That's what we'll contrast, 40 and 80. So 40 is thicker. You put it through the gauge and you adjust the gauge such that it's reading 220, okay? Now you put an 80 weight thread in the bobbin and you pull through the gauge. What do you think is going to happen? That little spring is not going to be pinching it quite as hard because it's finer, and most likely you will get a much lower reading, maybe 180, 190, something like that. So likely you will have to adjust the tension, but the number holds true. Does that make sense? You will probably have to tighten the tension for that finer thread so that it grips it, but you're still aiming for that 210 to 220. Faith is asking, I do use a TOA gauge and wondering if you pull the thread until it pulls from the bobbin casing or just until the gauge moves. I think I addressed that one, Faith. I give it a solid 12-inch, maybe longer pull, like after the gauge is moving, so that I can judge the smoothness of that gauge movement as well. That's important to me too. A few of these we read before. Wendy is asking one, which we talked about a little bit. I should be putting these on the screen. Since most of us can't see the back side of our quilts on the frame, if the bobbin tension is too tight, how can you tell by looking at how the top is stitching? And so we talked about running a finger underneath. We talked about looking from underneath. There also, over time, as you quilt more and more, you also learn to recognize the symptoms of stitches that are too loose or too tight, and particularly too loose from the top. So when that bobbin thread is tight, it does still look a little different from the top. So you kind of get that nuance and start to recognize that from the top side too. William is asking, another bobbin question for the Q24. Do you pull the thread up through the slot and hole at the bottom of the bobbin case? It runs exactly like a bobbin case on any sewing machine would. It's no different. It's running backwards. I'm just going to show you here. Can you see my slit is running? My slit is running that way, and my thread is pulling the other way. So it slides into that groove and then around that spring. Every machine I've ever used, it works that same way. Some go right and some go left, but the bobbin is always the opposite of the slit, and then you just follow it through around that little spring. I hope that made sense. Kimberly's asking, I have a sit-down long arm Q16. Is there something particular for this machine I should be aware of? No, I don't think so. It's just a giant sewing machine, honestly, and it has easier maintenance than a sewing machine. You can do a lot of it yourself. Meg is asking, with bobbin tightness, what else can I do to avoid the flat railroad look on the back if I followed the TOA and did well on the dangle test? I've even got a new Bernina bobbin case. Thanks. So is it staying the same railroad look no matter what adjustments you make? I'm kind of trying to follow that. Are you getting any differences happening when you make adjustments? And I'm going to add a funny one in here. I have sometimes found two things. One of them is I've sometimes found that if I literally change my bobbin casing, I will get better results. So I can be struggling making a bobbin tension adjustment, and it's just not getting right, not right, not right, not right, no matter what I do. So I will take my bobbin out, I keep a second case, I will put my bobbin in the other case, and magically it will work. I do not know the scientific reason for that. I just know sometimes it is so. And then a few weeks down the road, I might flip the process and go back to the original one. And secondly, this is true, and there probably is a reason behind this one. Sometimes when things are just frustrating, and you can't find the answer, taking a break is the answer. And I think I put that at the end of the book. Like sometimes just turn the power off and go get a decent night's sleep, take a walk, do something fun, come back tomorrow. And sometimes it just is better. Okay, Meg is answering me. Yes, occasionally I get a nice section of stitching on the back, but oftener than not, the railroad look. I do plan to not pull the fabric too tight. Really try that with the fabric. And I think if you have it as an option, give another bobbin case a try. If nothing else, it will let you isolate, is my bobbin case being the problem? It is possible for the bobbin case to be warped a little bit. It is possible for the spring to lose its springiness. It is certainly possible for the little spring inside it to lose its springiness and need replacing. So all those are factors, but if you try a brand new bobbin casing, that would help you to isolate that. Faith is asking, have you ever had to change out the bobbin spring? I have not, Faith, but I'll tell you what I have done, because I'm a self-help kind of gal. I've had the spring out and found, like when you put your bobbin in and it's got this little bit of springiness, right? This little bit of bounce. Sometimes I feel like mine has lost its bounce, a little bit like Tigger. And so I will take that spring out and I will literally go ooh, ooh, and bend it a bit and put it back in and give it more bounce. So I have done that. All right, you guys, I think we're going to call it at that for this one. I'm just letting you know I'm putting it out there to get myself committed. This is the first of a series of monthly workshops. So I intend for them to be the second Tuesday of each month. So be watching out for notification of the next one. They will all be machine quilting related, but varying topics each time. So I thank you for joining me, and I will catch up with you all again soon.